It was May 5th, 1945, and the Battle of Castle Itter was about to earn its reputation as the strangest battle of the Second World War. The conflict pitted mortal enemies against a common foe, and it did so just 48 hours before Germany's unconditional surrender. American soldiers, German Wehrmacht defectors, Austrian resistance fighters, and French political prisoners all put aside their differences to take on a fanatical unit of the Waffen-SS. To understand how such an absurd scenario came together, you have to start with the castle itself. Castle Itter sits on a forested hill near a small village in the North Tyrol region of Austria. Its foundations date back to the 13th century, and over the years it had served as a fortress, a ruin, and eventually a renovated hotel. After Germany annexed Austria in 1938, the castle was leased from its owner by the German government. Then, in February 1943, SS Lieutenant General Oswald Pohl seized the property outright on the orders of Heinrich Himmler. Within weeks, it was transformed into a special detention facility administered by the Dachau concentration camp system. But Castle Itter wasn't Dachau by any means, and instead it was a gilded cage for high-value French hostages. Former Prime Ministers Édouard Daladier and Paul Reynaud were held there, as were Generals Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, both former commanders-in-chief of the French army. Tennis star and nationalist politician Jean Barotra was also a captive, and he would play a major role in the battle to come. These were people the Reich considered useful as potential bargaining chips in future negotiations. Conditions were tolerable by wartime standards, but as Germany's military situation deteriorated through 1944 and into 1945, the prisoners began to fear they'd be executed. By late April 1945, the Third Reich was rapidly collapsing, and a steady stream of senior SS officers passed through Castle Itter while fleeing the Allied advance. On April 30th, Eduard Weiter, the last commandant of Dachau, arrived with a retinue of subordinates and their families. Weiter had ordered the execution of roughly 2,000 prisoners before abandoning the camp. His presence terrified the French captives, who were well aware of the massacres at Dachau and feared his arrival foreshadowed their own deaths. But on May 2nd, he was found dead of gunshot wounds in disputed circumstances. Weiter's death rattled Sebastian Wimmer, the castle's commandant, an SS officer who'd grown increasingly uneasy with the situation in Europe. Wimmer apparently assured the French prisoners he wouldn't allow harm to come to them and would even help them escape if necessary, but his nerve didn't hold. Shortly after Weiter's death, Wimmer and the remaining SS guards abandoned Castle Itter entirely, leaving the prisoners in control, but surrounded by hostile territory. The prisoners armed themselves with whatever weapons the fleeing guards had left behind and began planning their own rescue. On May 3rd, they sent Zvonimir Kukovic, a Yugoslav resistance member working as a handyman, to find Allied forces. The nearest town was occupied by German troops, so he pushed 40 miles up the Inn River Valley toward Innsbruck. Late that evening, he reached an advance party of the American 103rd Infantry Division. A rescue force was assembled but was halted by heavy shelling halfway to the castle and then recalled by superiors who determined the operation fell outside their jurisdiction. Back at the castle, the prisoners had no idea whether Kukovic had succeeded, and on May 4th, they sent Andreas Krobat, the castle's Czech cook, toward a local town on a bicycle. Krobat's ride changed everything, because on the road he encountered Major Sepp Gangl, a Wehrmacht officer who'd turned against the regime. He was leading a small band of German soldiers, mostly from Bavaria, working alongside the Austrian resistance. Gangl knew about Castle Itter and had wanted to liberate it, but lacked the manpower. Learning that the guards had fled gave him the opening he needed. Gangel found what he was looking for about 8 miles north. A tank platoon from the 12th Armored Division, led by First Lieutenant Jack Lee. Lee had spent 5 months leading his unit across France, through Germany, and into Austria, earning a Bronze Star along the way. His Sherman tank was nicknamed Besottin' Jenny, reportedly after one of his soldiers' unfaithful girlfriends. Lee was tired. Everyone was tired. The war was essentially over, and nobody wanted to die in its final hours. But when Gangel laid out the situation, Lee agreed to help. Lee assembled a ragtag convoy, his own tank, a second Sherman, additional armor, some infantrymen, and Gangel's Wehrmacht soldiers. They set off on the evening of May 4th to liberate the castle and its prisoners, but a bridge collapsed after the lead tanks crossed, cutting off infantry support. Lee had to leave tanks behind to guard key positions, and by the time the convoy reached Castle Itter, the rescue force had been whittled down substantially. They had the Besottin' Jenny, about a dozen Americans, and a handful of Gangel's Germans. At the castle, they were joined by Kurt Siegfried Schrader, an injured Waffen-SS captain who'd been befriended by the French prisoners. The French prisoners were grateful but hardly reassured by the rescue force's size. Lee positioned Besottin' Jenny at the main gate, placed his men in defensive positions, and settled in for a siege. He didn't have enough vehicles to evacuate everyone, and moving elderly generals and politicians through SS-patrolled roads would have been more dangerous than staying put. They'd have to hold the position until American reinforcements arrived or more German or Austrian deserters showed up. Unfortunately for them, the Waffen-SS came on the morning of May 5th. Between 100 and 150 troops launched their assault with machine guns, small arms, and at least one anti-tank cannon. Lee had ordered the French prisoners to take cover, but they refused. Former prime ministers, generals, resistance fighters, and a tennis champion picked up weapons and fought alongside the Americans and Germans. The fighting was brutal, and machine gun fire hammered the castle walls, blowing out narrow windows and sending chunks of masonry across the interior courtyard. An anti-tank shell destroyed Gamelin's empty room in the upper floor, and had he taken cover as requested, he would have perished right there. Then a second round slammed into Besottin' Jenny. Corporal Edward Shimchick barely escaped before the fuel tanks ignited, and the Sherman erupted in flames. The burning wreck of the tank at the main gate, which had been their strongest defensive asset, now served only as a grim beacon. Without its firepower, the defenders were in serious trouble. Ammunition was running low, and SS troops swarmed from the tree line toward the main gate. In the chaos, Major Gangel, the leader of the German defectors, was hit by a sniper's bullet while trying to move former Prime Minister Reynaud out of the line of fire. He perished instantly, the only defender to die that day. His death was a gut punch, but the remaining defenders kept fighting. Lee eventually reached the Austrian resistance by telephone and secured 3 additional fighters who drove to the castle under heavy fire. They needed every man they could get to defend the castle, and thankfully their strong defensive position was a force multiplier, so the 3 additional men punched above their weight. With ammunition nearly gone, Lee needed to get word to the 142nd Infantry Regiment about the severity of the situation. Jean Barotra, the 60-year-old tennis star, volunteered to vault the castle wall and sprint through a hail of bullets to reach American lines. Lee accepted, knowing that desperate times called for desperate measure, and Barotra scaled the wall and ran. Despite his age, the former Wimbledon champion made it through without being hit. He reached the 142nd, delivered Lee's message, and then did something entirely in character. He requested a uniform and a rifle and joined the relief force heading back to the castle. The 142nd arrived at roughly 4 in the afternoon, bringing troops and armor that overwhelmed the remaining SS attackers. The battle was over. Nearly 100 SS soldiers were taken prisoner. Every single French captive survived. Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross and was promoted to captain. Schrader, the Waffen-SS defector, was arrested for his former affiliation and sentenced to 2 years in prison, though this was later shortened in recognition of his actions in the fight. It's tempting to treat the Battle of Castle Itter as a curiosity, a weird footnote, but the stakes were higher than they appear. Edouard Daladier and Reynaud had been wartime prime ministers, and Weygand and Gamelin had commanded France's armies. Their survival meant they could contribute to the reconstruction of post-war France and shape its approach to European integration. It's very possible that Major Gangel, heroically sacrificing his life for the lives of his former enemies, may have played an outsized role in the thawing of Franco-German relations. Had the Waffen-SS overrun the castle, French post-war politics could have looked meaningfully different. Major Gangel was posthumously honored as an Austrian national hero, as well as being fairly well known in his home state of Bavaria as well. The story of Castle Itter is a reminder that in the final chaotic hours of the most destructive conflict in human history, people on opposite sides of a war found a reason to stand together. While the battle lasted less than a day, and the Second World War was effectively over, it would provide one of the most oddly compelling narratives of the entire conflict. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a quick reminder to hit the like and subscribe buttons and share this video with your friends and family who enjoy historical content. Also remember to check out the Patreon or YouTube membership if you want to support me even further. On the morning of December 8, 1941, just hours after Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, a different kind of catastrophe was unfolding on the other side of the Pacific. In the pre-dawn darkness over Hong Kong, waves of Japanese bombers roared across the border from occupied China and obliterated the colony's tiny air force on the ground at Kai Tak Airport. 5 obsolete planes were destroyed in minutes, and the entire aerial defense of a British Crown colony, home to over 1.5 million people, was wiped out. What followed over the next 18 days was one of the most dramatic and lopsided campaigns of the Second World War. It was an assault that ended in Britain's first full colonial surrender to a foreign power since the American Revolution. Hong Kong in late 1941 wasn't supposed to hold, and the British military planners knew it. Winston Churchill himself had called the colony's defense an impossibility as early as January of that year, describing any reinforcement as a waste of resources. This proclamation would, in time, come to blemish Churchill's reputation in one of the most developed corners of the British Empire. The colony sat at the southern tip of China, surrounded on 3 sides by territory Japan had already seized. It had no strategic depth, no room to maneuver, and no realistic prospect of relief. And yet, in a decision driven more by politics than by military logic, the garrison was reinforced in November 1941. Nearly 2,000 Canadian troops from the Winnipeg Grenadiers and the Royal Rifles of Canada arrived, and most of these soldiers had never seen combat. Some hadn't even completed basic training. They were sailing into a death trap, and nobody in Ottawa seemed to fully grasp what was in store for these Canadians. The Japanese assault was led by Lieutenant General Takashi Sakai, commanding the 38th Division and elements of the 23rd Army. His force numbered roughly 20,000 experienced, battle-hardened troops who'd spent years fighting across China. Opposing them was a garrison of around 14,000 men, a patchwork of British, Canadian, Indian, and local Hong Kong volunteer units, all under Major General Christopher Maltby. The defenders were spread thin across the new territories, Kowloon, and Hong Kong Island, trying to cover far too much ground with far too few soldiers. The plan was to hold the gin drinkers' line, a series of defensive positions stretching across the new territories. It was modeled loosely on the Maginot Line concept, but it had never been properly completed and was severely undermanned. The line was supposed to hold for at least a week, but it fell in a single night. On December 9th, Japanese forces attacked the Shingmun Redoubt, a key position held by the 2nd Royal Scots Battalion. The redoubt was supposed to be defended by a full company, but like everything else in Hong Kong, was undermanned to the extreme. The Japanese infiltrated the tunnels and bunkers under cover of darkness and overwhelmed the defenders in brutal close-quarters fighting. By dawn, the position was lost, and with it any hope of a sustained defense on the mainland. What followed was a fighting retreat across Kowloon. Indian and British troops fell back through the dense urban landscape, demolishing infrastructure as they went. Oil tanks at Lai Chi were set ablaze, sending towers of black smoke over the harbor, and ferries scrambled to evacuate soldiers across Victoria Harbor to Hong Kong Island. By December 13th, just 5 days into the battle, all areas on the mainland had been abandoned, and the defense now rested on the island of Hong Kong itself. According to traditional tactical thought, launching an assault in this sort of situation would have been unthinkable, so negotiations began in earnest. General Sakai sent a formal demand for surrender on December 13th, but Maltby refused. Churchill cabled instructions that there was to be no thought of surrender, and that every part of the island must be fought for. It was a noble sentiment from a man sitting comfortably in London, but it offered no practical solution. The defenders were outgunned, outmanned, and running low on everything from ammunition to clean water. For 4 days, Japanese artillery pounded the island's northern shore from positions in Kowloon. The bombardment was relentless, targeting pillboxes, gun emplacements, and communication lines. Japanese aircraft bombed the island with near impunity, since Hong Kong's anti-aircraft defenses were woefully inadequate. The constant shelling shattered telephone lines, making coordination between units nearly impossible. Defenders were forced to rely on runners, a throwback to First World War tactics that cost precious time and lives. Since Maltby had no aerial reconnaissance of any nature whatsoever, he couldn't be sure what the Japanese were planning next. An amphibious assault would be much more costly for the Japanese, and it appeared that they sought to launch a blitzkrieg in the Pacific. However, the British were also sure that the Japanese knew that the island of Hong Kong was completely isolated and would rapidly be devoid of the necessities of life. Hong Kong couldn't sustain itself on its own, so it was possible that the Japanese would simply settle into a siege until the British forces surrendered. On the night of December 18th, there would be no further doubts when the Japanese launched their amphibious assault on the island. 3 battalions crossed the harbor in small boats, landing on the northeastern shore between North Point and Taiko. Searchlights that were supposed to illuminate the approaching boats had been knocked out by shell fire. Some defensive positions fought ferociously, but the Japanese established a beachhead and pushed inland with terrifying speed. By morning, they'd cut the island's defenses in two, driving a wedge between the forces in the east under Brigadier Cedric Wallace and those in the west under Brigadier John Lawson. The fighting at Wong Nai Chung Gap stands as one of the most desperate episodes of the entire campaign. The gap was a vital mountain pass connecting the north and south sides of the island, and Brigadier Lawson had established his headquarters there. When Japanese forces stormed the position on December 19th, Lawson and his staff found themselves surrounded and fighting for their lives. According to accounts passed down through the brigade, Lawson reportedly told his subordinates that he was going outside to fight it out rather than be captured. He was slain in combat shortly afterward, becoming the highest-ranking Canadian officer to die in combat during the Second World War. The Winnipeg Grenadiers and Royal Rifles fought with extraordinary courage in the days that followed. They mounted counterattacks against fortified Japanese positions, despite having no prior combat experience. Company Sergeant Major John Osborne of the Winnipeg Grenadiers would be awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross for his actions, the only one given for the Hong Kong campaign. The Victoria Cross is the highest award for valor in the British Empire and is essentially the equivalent of the Medal of Honor. And when you hear what he did to win this award, you'll understand exactly why he won it. No questions asked. In an act of extreme heroism, he'd thrown himself on a Japanese grenade, effectively using his body to absorb the blast that would have eliminated a number of his comrades. These soldiers who were defending Hong Kong weren't lacking in bravery in the least. Unfortunately, though, they lacked everything else: training, equipment, leadership at the strategic level, and most of all, a fighting chance. The final week was a grinding, horrifying affair. Japanese forces advanced steadily across the island, capturing reservoir after reservoir and cutting off the water supply. Pockets of resistance held out with remarkable tenacity, particularly around the island's southern tip. But the outcome was never in doubt, and each day brought the defenders closer to collapse as ammunition dwindled and the water situation became critical. The Japanese committed numerous atrocities during the battle's final days. At the Silesian mission on December 19th, wounded soldiers from a field hospital were bayoneted in their beds. At St. Stephen's College on Christmas morning, Japanese troops entered the emergency hospital and targeted the doctors and nurses for slaughter. The logic appears to have been that if the medical professionals were eliminated, the defenders would lose their capacity to fight even faster. These weren't isolated incidents of battlefield frenzy. They formed a pattern of deliberate brutality that would continue and intensify during the years of occupation that followed. And disturbingly, these tactics were highly effective for the Imperial Japanese soldiers, at least in the short run. At 3:15 in the afternoon on December 25, 1941, Governor Sir Mark Young walked into the dining room of the Peninsula Hotel in Kowloon. There he found General Sakai was waiting and signed the instrument of surrender. It was Christmas Day, and for the garrison survivors and the colony's civilian population, it marked the beginning of 3 years and 8 months of Japanese occupation. The British called it Black Christmas, and Hong Kong wouldn't be free again until August 1945, living under conditions that worsened over the course of the war in the Pacific. The battle's toll was staggering for its brevity, and the garrison suffered over 4,000 casualties. Of the nearly 2,000 Canadians who'd arrived just weeks earlier, 290 were dead and 493 wounded. Disturbingly, though, in many cases, those who fell in combat were the lucky ones. Many who survived the fighting wouldn't survive the horrific nature of the Japanese prison camps. Over the next 4 years, another 264 Canadian prisoners died from disease, starvation, forced labor, and execution in camps across Hong Kong and Japan. The Japanese, for their part, suffered roughly 3,000 casualties, a price they considered entirely acceptable for seizing one of Asia's most important ports. Notably, this number was considered exceptionally good for how brazen the attack was, and since they engaged in significant urban fighting and an amphibious landing, it was quite low. The fall of Hong Kong reverberated through the Allied world. Coming alongside the simultaneous disasters at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and Wake Island, it shattered the myth of Western military invincibility in Asia. For Canada, the battle sparked a bitter political controversy that lasted decades, centering on why inadequately trained troops had been sent to a position everyone knew was indefensible. A royal commission investigated after the war, but ultimately assigned no blame, a conclusion that satisfied almost nobody. Ultimately, many Canadians ended up blaming Winston Churchill for shipping these Canadian men to defend the undefendable. They came to believe that he wouldn't have been so careless with British troops from the home island. Many also question why Churchill didn't simply allow the garrison to surrender, perhaps in exchange for safe passage for the men stationed there. This wasn't a glorious final stand that tied up Japanese units, while the Allies were achieving some other goal elsewhere. There was no apparent overall strategic goal to not negotiating a surrender, potentially securing favorable terms for the troops and for Hong Kong itself. Today, the battle's memory lives on in the cemeteries and memorials scattered across Hong Kong. The fall of Hong Kong wasn't the war's largest battle or its most strategically significant, but it remains a powerful reminder of what happens when opaque political calculations override military reality. It also shows exactly what happens when ordinary soldiers are asked to pay the price for decisions made by people who'll never hear a shot fired.